Hello everyone. Welcome to Praxis's debut event of the semester, and I'm glad you all took the time out of your busy start of the semester schedule to come hear about antitrust and big tech in the Chicago School. So, Kacey Reeves West is a fourth-year PhD student in the Department of Economics at George Mason University and a PhD fellow at the Mercatus Center. Kacey has taught economics as a lecturer for Christendom College, George Mason, and George Washington University's Central Asia program. Her research has been published in Business Ethics Quarterly and the Review of Austrian Economics. She focuses on topics of industrial organization within Smithian political economy. Kacey graduated from Hillsdale in 2018 with a Bachelor of Arts in Economics and Spanish. She is married to Garrett West, a fellow Hillsdale College graduate with whom she is expecting their first child in November. So please welcome Kacey.
All right, hi everyone. Thank you very much to Alex and the rest of the Praxis team for having me here, especially at the beginning of the semester when I know schedules are so busy. But it's a huge honor to be back, and I'm really excited to talk about this today with you all. But I figure before we tackle the big stuff, which is the question whether the Chicago School in all its glory has in fact failed or not, I would do a little bit of an overview of antitrust, what is the Chicago School, and what is big tech from an economic perspective, just in case we have any non-economists or budding economists in the room. So antitrust basically refers to the body of law that essentially governs economic competition in the United States. It's been around since 1890. It originated with the Sherman Act and is currently enforced by two organizations in the US, the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice. And antitrust law is responsible for a lot of things, maybe too many things, but it's most well known for making sure that the biggest businesses in America are playing fairly together. So not preying or predating on one another. They're actually acting in a competitive manner. So we can think of the Standard Oil case in 1911. The photo's a little blurry from the projector, so I apologize. But here Standard Oil was found guilty of monopolization from the Supreme Court and was basically busted up into 34 smaller companies. We can think of the famous United States versus Microsoft case, which if any of you have taken Dr. McGrassick's IO class, you will study, or you have studied it in depth. But essentially the court found Microsoft guilty of monopolization because it was bundling its Internet Explorer and Windows packages together, and that was bad news. And more recently, there have been a wave of cases brought to court against some of the biggest tech industries in the US. So there are cases against Apple and Google that are underway and will probably be underway for many years. In the way that these cases will be decided, whether these big tech companies are competitive or non-competitive, will not only depend on past precedent or past legal precedent, but depend on how that past precedent and the current economic conditions are interpreted. When you begin to study antitrust, you realize there's a lot of room for interpretation because antitrust is in itself very vague. And it's been vague since the beginning when the Sherman Act made what they called monopolization illegal. I don't really know what monopolization means. Maybe some of you do, but it's a very vague term that people have struggled to define over the past 100 or so years. But this brings me to the Chicago School of Economics. So the legal and economic theories that have come out of the Chicago School beginning in the 1970s have provided the most influence over the interpretation of antitrust law in the US. The Chicago School has been one of the main forces in how we have been deciding these antitrust cases from the 70s upwards through the 2000s, and is only now beginning to be threatened by a group called the Neo-Brandisians, which I'll get to in a second. But when I say the Chicago School, I know many of you immediately think of economists like Milton Friedman and George Stigler. But today, some of the most important characters we'll be thinking about are people like Robert Bork, Frank Easterbrook, and Richard Posner, who were legal academics at Chicago and not only embraced the writings of people like Stigler and Friedman and sort of the economic frame of mind, but were then actually able to implement that economic theory into the legal decision-making practice, because at one point or another, they were all eventually appointed as judges in the United States. So they are responsible for making the Chicago School sort of a living, breathing part of antitrust. But what the Chicago School is most well known for, you could say, is their promotion of what is called the consumer welfare standard. And what that means is when you are deciding an antitrust case, you evaluate whether the firm has made consumers better or worse off. So rather than assuming, like, oh, I think this firm is acting in an anti-competitive manner because it looks a little suspicious to me, you actually dig a little deeper and say, how has the firm affected allocative efficiency? How has the firm affected product variety or product quality? Is the firm charging super high prices that are making consumers worse off? And if it's found that the firm is in fact making consumers worse off, it has violated the consumer welfare standard, and a case can be made against it in court. And this consumer welfare standard, maybe it sounds intuitive to you, but it wasn't intuitive for a while. It actually challenged the status quo that was brought about by Joseph Bain's structure, conduct, performance model, which essentially alleged that the structure, the size of the firm, determined how that firm then would act or perform in the marketplace. And implicit in this model is the idea that as the firm becomes larger, it will de facto begin to act in an anti-competitive manner. So you sort of get the idea that big is bad. And the Chicago School sort of turned that idea on its head. But the Chicago School has been held under fire in the last 5 or 10 years by a group called the New Brandeisians. They're named after Louis Brandeis, who was a former Supreme Court justice and was famous for writing a book called The Curse of Bigness in 1911. So you can sort of begin to understand which side of things Brandeis was on, sort of the big is bad sort of mantra. But the New Brandeisians have gained a lot of popularity thanks to this woman on the left, Lena Khan, who published Amazon's Antitrust Paradox in 2017 as a third-year student at Yale Law School. And in this paper or note, which is very widely referenced and cited now, she makes the case that the Chicago School is outdated and can no longer deal with big tech because their arguments are their arguments don't account for all of the new challenges brought by technology. They don't understand that the size of business matters, et cetera, et cetera. And she wrote this in 2017, and no later than 2021 was she appointed as the chair of the Federal Trade Commission, which, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, is one of the two organizations that is actually responsible for prosecuting antitrust. And I emphasize this because I think it's really quite fascinating that this movement has gained so much ground and so much influence and finds himself in such a position of power within about 5 or 10 years, when it took the Chicago School itself like 10 or 20 years to even begin to have the influence that we know and respect today. So this is a real threat to the Chicago School today. And why is it a threat? What is so different about big tech that we can even begin to think, oh, the Chicago School should be thrown in the trash because their arguments no longer apply here? Well, the biggest and most prominent tech companies in the US today are what is known as platform companies or digital platform companies. Platform companies essentially provide a platform, like a digital space, for buyers and sellers to meet. So these companies are also called two-sided markets, because you have the consumers on one side and the producers on the other. You can think of Uber. We open Uber, which is the platform, and we, the consumer, are looking for a ride, and Uber automatically, or pretty almost automatically, connects us to a producer or someone who's willing to take us on that ride. So Uber is the platform that brings us together. But Uber and other digital platform companies are unique because they don't actually create inventory. They don't really sell a physical product. What they do is essentially collapse the traditional marketplace and onto a 2D screen and annihilate hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of transaction costs in the process, which is really cool. And there's a lot of new research coming out on platform companies, which if you're interested in, you might look into. But there are two features of platform companies that sort of freak out groups of scholars like the New Brandeisians. One is that they grow really big, really quickly, because they enjoy a lot of economies of scale. And these economies of scale are brought about, one, by the reduction of transaction costs, like I just mentioned, and two, the accrual of network effects. And network effects exist when an additional member joins sort of a platform or a group, and just being there sort of confers additional utility to everyone else in the group. So we can think of something like Facebook, which is a digital platform company. If it's only you and your grandma who's posting pictures of her cat on Facebook, it's not going to be really fun. You can take care of that business on the phone. But when there are 10 people on Facebook, 20 people, 500 people, and they're all talking about anything from cats to politics to school, it's more interesting to you, you receive more benefit. And so that's essentially what the network effects are. But these are concerning to groups like the New Brandeisians because to them, these network effects, these economies of scale, function as a barrier to entry in the marketplace. They worry that as Uber's network grows larger, it will be harder for another firm to compete and grow another network. Because once people are a part of Uber, it's harder for them to transition over to, say, Lyft, perhaps. And then the other feature of platforms are that they have I'll call it like weird pricing schemes, in which we have to remember that there are two sides of the market, the producers and the consumers that they're bringing together. And so often these platform companies will charge one side of the market while allowing the other side of the market to use the platform for free. So again, we can think of Facebook. I don't have to pay to use Facebook, you don't have to pay to use Facebook, but the advertisers, the other side of the market, have to pay to put their ads on Facebook. And these pricing strategies are all part of the big, they call it the chicken and the egg problem, which is how does a platform actually bring consumers and producers to the market at the same time? And a lot of theory and strategy goes into this. But these pricing schemes in which these platforms often charge one side of the market, either a low or zero price, sort of give off like maybe a sirens to people worried about what is called predatory pricing. So the New Brandeisians in particular are concerned that platforms are sort of predating on other firms by offering really low prices and trying to drive out other forms of competition from the marketplace with those low prices, and then ratchet those prices up when the competition has left and enjoy monopoly profits. So even though these pricing schemes are very natural to a platform can't really function without them, they cause a lot of concern over whether they are predatory or not. Okay, so now we've done our little review on antitrust, the Chicago School, and tech from the perspective from an economic perspective. So we get to the big question, which is, has the Chicago School failed? And by this, I mean, is the Chicago School still able to be a part of the conversation in antitrust today? Or are their theories too outdated? The New Brandeisians say yes. And as a bit of a roadmap for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to take you through 3 of their biggest claims against the Chicago School, and then I will offer 3 counterclaims myself. So that's where we're going. But claim 1 against the Chicago School is that they claim that the Chicago School, or the New Brandeisians, don't read the quote yet, I'll read this with you, but the New Brandeisians claim that the Chicago School has a very limited conception of consumer welfare. We talked about the consumer welfare standard a little bit earlier, and which again, it looks for things like about the quality of products, the variety of products, the prices of products, all of those things go into consumer welfare. But the New Brandeisians claim that the Chicago School only cares about consumer welfare insofar as it can guarantee low prices in every period. So they say that, oh, the Chicago School doesn't care about product quality or variety or things like innovation. They only care about keeping prices low in the immediate short run, which again, because of that, they say the Chicago School has blinders on when it comes to concerns with predatory pricing. Okay, so with these claims, I'm going to have us read a little passage from Lena Kahn's Amazon Antitrust Paradox, only because I think it's important for you to know what she's saying, and I don't want to put words into her mouth. So could I have a volunteer from the audience to read this for everyone? Thank you.
Due to a change in legal thinking and practice in the 1970s and 80s, antitrust law now assesses competition largely with an eye to the short-term interests of consumers, not producers, or the health of the market as a whole. Antitrust doctrine views low consumer prices alone to be the evidence of sound competition. By this measure, Amazon has excelled. All
right, thank you. So yeah, she says, in this first sentence, she says, due to a change of legal thinking and the practice in the 1970s and 80s, there she's referring to the Chicago School. That was the big change in the 70s and 80s. And then she goes on to claim that the Chicago School is only interested in the short term, and they are only interested in keeping prices low in the short term. And then goes on to explain how Amazon, which she talks about a ton in her note, is able to get away with predatory pricing because when a firm engages in predatory pricing, they obviously are offering a price in the short run. So if the Chicago School is only concerned with keeping prices low in the short run, then big bad firms like Amazon can get away with whatever they want. So that's her first claim, is that the Chicago School has a very limited conception of consumer welfare. Okay, claim number 2, which is that the Chicago School is blinded by its focus on neoclassical models. Can I have another volunteer to read this passage? You.
Me. Focusing primarily on price and output undermines effective antitrust enforcement by delaying intervention until market power is being actively exercised and largely ignoring whether and how it is being acquired.
Okay, thank you. So what I want to focus on in this passage is mostly her phrase, price and output. She uses this phrase a lot, mostly in a derogatory sense. She talks about the tools of price and output, how the Chicago School is blinded by price and output. And does anyone know what she is referring to when she talks about this? Think back to the first day of Micro 101. Here. So what she's referring to are the big group of neoclassical models like supply and demand, in which we look at them through price and output. So she makes a claim throughout her work that the Chicago School is so focused on these tools, these neoclassical models that every econ student learns in Econ 101, that they're sort of blinded to reality. So the thing about economics is that you spend all of undergrad learning about supply and demand, perfect competition, monopolies, etc. And then you get to grad school and realize, oh, if I think of the marketplace as exactly as represented by these models, I'll be laughed at because these models are not totally realistic. So in this claim, she's mocking the Chicago School for being so blinded by these tools that they have no conception of what's going on outside of them. Okay, so claim number 3, which is that antitrust as a body of legal theory needs to be overhauled in order to recognize what she calls the competitive process. And this one is very important. So one final volunteer.
The Chicago School shifted the analytical emphasis away from the process, the conditions necessary for competition, and toward an outcome, namely consumer welfare. I propose that a better way to understand competition is by focusing on competitive process and market structure. This is because the best guardian of competition is a competitive process.
Okay, thank you. So again, I'll repeat the very last line, which is the best guardian of competition is a competitive process. And this is a big rallying cry Kahn uses throughout her piece that attacks the Chicago school. She uses this term over 15 times. Like, oh, the Chicago school neglects the competitive process. We need to throw out their work and replace it with new Brandeisian theory because we recognize the competitive process. But she doesn't offer a clear definition of what the competitive process is, and I'll get to this a little bit later in the talk, but I do want to highlight this as very important for my arguments later on. Okay, so those are the 3 big claims levied against the Chicago school by Lina Kahn and the New Brandeisians. So now I want to offer 3 counter arguments. I argue no. I'm giving it away. I don't think the Chicago school can be thrown out with the bathwater, and I'll show you why. And again, I feel these arguments are a little bit controversial because most people accept the mischaracterization of the Chicago school and accept that things need to change and that the theories given by the Chicago school need to just go die with the rest of academia that's been created by old white men or something like that. But that is not the case. And the Chicago school has some very, very worthwhile theory that needs to continue to inform our understanding of antitrust. Okay, so I'm going to counterclaim 1 and argue that the Chicago school does have a rich conception of consumer welfare. And I'm going to argue that by talking about their actual analysis of predatory pricing. So the New Brandeisians assert that the Chicago school doesn't really have any tools to recognize when a price is actually predatory. They just accept all low prices as kosher. But they actually have a very sophisticated analysis thanks to Easterbrook, who wrote in the 1980s. And before Easterbrook came along, the standard conventional method of determining whether a price was predatory or not was using what was called the Arita-Turner test, where you essentially compare the firm's price with its average variable cost. If the price is lower than the firm's average variable cost, then it's anti-competitive. And Easterbrook says, you know, the funny thing about low prices is that low prices that are anti-competitive and low prices that are brought on by innovation and efficiency kind of look exactly the same. They're all low prices. So he offers a theory of recoupment to help us discern whether a low price is actually predatory or competitive. And this theory of recoupment looks at the firm over multiple time periods. And let's imagine we're talking about a market for basketballs or something like that. So let's say one basketball company comes in and sells a ton of basketballs at a lower price than everyone else, and everyone else goes out of business. So many people would assume that the basketball company with low prices was perhaps acting in an anti-competitive manner. But Easterbrook says you actually have to look at what happens after those firms go out of business. So we need to investigate whether the new basketball company actually erects barriers of entry to the marketplace, whether it blocks new competition. And then even if it does block new competition, we need to figure out if the basketball company is even able to recoup the profits it lost by selling basketballs at an artificially low price. So that was the Chicago school's method of dealing with predatory pricing, was looking at it over multiple time periods to actually discern whether a low price was helping consumers and was passed along because of cost advantages or efficiency, or whether it was an actual predatory price. And then we see in Telser, who wrote in the 1960s, that the Chicago school actually conceives of a time where prices higher than normal, so prices higher than marginal cost, might actually benefit consumers. So Telser's argument focuses on what is called resale price maintenance, which essentially resale price maintenance occurs when you have a manufacturer and a distributor, and the manufacturer agrees to give its product to the distributor if the distributor sells the product at a minimum price floor that's higher than marginal cost. And before Telser wrote, the assumption was that every instance of resale price maintenance was anti-competitive. You're selling a price at a higher price. Like, no consumer likes that. But Telser makes an argument, which is intricate and interesting, and I won't really cover right now, but he argues that actually by setting this, in many instances, when manufacturers set this resale price, they do it as a means to maintain product quality. And in that sense, they protect the interest of consumers for particular products in which consumers do value having extra services or extra qualities in whatever product it is. So we see that, one, the Chicago School is not okay with every low price in every circumstance. They are aware that predatory pricing exists, and they have means to evaluate it. And they also understand that consumer welfare can be represented more than just a low price. Consumers are also interested in things like quality and variety, and they get that. Okay, so now I want to counter claim 2, which is that the Chicago School is not bound by these neoclassical models, like supply and demand, perfect competition. And I want to clarify what I mean here, because the Chicago School popularized a lot of these models, and a lot of their research is sort of grounded in these models. So I'm not arguing that they don't use them. They certainly use them, and these models certainly benefited their research. But what I'm arguing is that their conception of competition and reality was not dictated by these stringent mathematical conditions. They didn't expect the marketplace to actually look like a perfectly competitive model. And we can sort of see that with the examples I just gave on the previous slide with the Chicago School justifying either low prices or high prices, because if you are concerned with keeping a perfectly competitive model, you automatically reject any idea of low or high prices, because in your mind, a competitive firm would have no reason to do that. Every firm prices at marginal cost, right? So we begin to see how they work in and out of the models with the previous examples. But I want to give another example from Dimsets, who had some great work on natural monopolies and public utilities published in the late 60s and 70s. But Dimsets developed this theory that he called competition for the field. And this theory was based on the standard monopoly model. But he argued that natural monopolies face competition even when they're alone in their field. Even when a natural monopoly is, say, the only person producing basketballs in the country, they face that natural monopoly still faces the threat of invisible competition from other firms that are envious of their spot. Other firms are watching them to see if they slip up. Other firms are watching the natural monopolists to see if they can squeeze in any such way. And maybe we don't know how, and maybe the natural monopolist doesn't know how. But that's the thing about competition. It's really sneaky, and it occurs in ways we never expect. That's how people get outcompeted. So Dimsets argues that even natural monopolies often they face these invisible competitive forces that push prices down from the monopoly level down closer to marginal cost. So again, that's an example of how the Chicago School works with these models, but they work with them intuitively. They're not bound strictly by these rules. And I want to contrast this image of the Chicago School that I'm giving to you with what the economic theory offered by the New Brandeisians looks like. So I'm continuing to counter claim 2, and I want to make the argument that the New Brandeisians, despite their critique of the Chicago School, are actually bound by this textbook understanding of economics. So in Lena Kahn's note, which again is the most definitive text they have, at least regarding economics, she offers 2 solutions with how we should be dealing with big tech. Solution number 1 is essentially enforcing a state of competition. Solution number 2 is essentially enforcing a state of monopoly. But let's talk about the first one, which is enforcing competition. What does that mean? She describes some sort of environment where there is free entry and exit. There are many firms, and those firms all sell identical products at marginal cost. Now, what do these assumptions sound like to you guys? And I know you've learned this in Micro 101. What was that? Perfect competition. The marketplace that Lena Khan is describing as ideal and as something that we should be striving to create is simply a rendition of the perfectly competitive model in which there are many firms, free entry and exit, identical products, etc. And the thing we all know about the perfect competition model is that it's not real. But she wants to create this version of the marketplace and recommends she says we can accomplish this by creating these prophylactic bans on any pricing below marginal cost to try to prevent predation or whatnot, and any sort of vertical merger in every circumstance. So no exceptions. If a firm has some sort of cost advantage and can offer its product as a lower price to a consumer, too bad. You can't do that because there's a prophylactic ban against it because it might be anti-competitive and it certainly doesn't adhere to the perfect competition model. Okay, so that's her first solution. The other solution is to just assume that competition isn't possible with these big tech firms and then just accept the fact that the market would tend toward monopolization. So she suggests preventing the process from even happening in the first place by choosing one legal monopolist and regulating that monopolist. So essentially we can think of like the rideshare industry, like Uber, Lyft. I know there are others. But with this solution, it would essentially be placing Uber as the natural monopolist, kicking everyone else out of the market, and regulating Uber by putting price ceilings on their product, blocking new entry, etc. So we see with these two solutions, this enforcing competition and enforcing legal monopoly, that there is no, I don't know, it's so black and white. There is no in between. It's either perfect competition or it's enforcing a legal state of monopoly. And if that's not a textbook understanding of economics, I don't know what is. These are the tools of price and output that she has been criticizing the Chicago School of using, and we can see that her understanding of the marketplace is clearly defined by them. Okay, and I'm going to go on to the third claim and argue that the Chicago School has a rich understanding of what Lena Khan calls the competitive process. But first, we need to ask what the competitive process is. As I said earlier, she mentions this over 15 times in her paper, but never offers a clear definition of it. She sort of alludes that the competitive process would help us understand that competition takes place across multiple margins, like perhaps price or quality, and that this is relevant for consumers because consumer welfare also exists upon multiple margins, whether that be price, quality, innovation, etc. So she doesn't define it, but to me, it sounds very reminiscent of something that hopefully all of you at Hillsdale are familiar with, which is the market process tradition, which is closely aligned with the Austrian school of thought. But the market process tradition, which spans from Adam Smith to Friedrich Hayek to Israel Kirzner to many of our own professors here at Hillsdale College, looks at competition as a process that takes place over time. It recognizes that as firms compete, many things are discovered in the process that were not known already. And entrepreneurs engage in fierce rivalry, trying to take each other down. And well, that sounds pretty anti-competitive, but I mean, that's what competition is. When you play basketball against a team and you're trying to win, you go hard. And the market process tradition recognizes that competition in reality, it's hard to replicate, it's hard to predict because these firms are actually competing with one another. And that doesn't make it unfair, it just makes it competition. But one of the big trademarks of the market process tradition is that they refuse to look at the market at one single point in time and then make some projection on what's going on based on one snapshot of time. Rather, they look at the market over periods of time to try to understand what firms are doing. Because they understand, like Easterbrook did with his analysis of predatory pricing, that just looking at a low price doesn't tell you whether it's anti-competitive or competitive or not. You actually have to look at firm behavior surrounding it. So I argue that the Chicago School actually has a rich conception of this sort of competitive process, this market process. Like Adam Smith, they recognize that competition is a species of warfare. It takes place in a lot of unexpected ways. Like Joseph Schumpeter, they recognize that competition is an ever-present threat that exists even when the businessman is alone in his field. That's exactly what Dimsdorf was arguing in his theory on natural monopoly. And I argue that the Chicago School recognizes that you can't take snapshots of the economy and claim you know what's going on. You have to look at it over time, which is a big argument promoted by Israel Kirzner. And I don't want to take this comparison for granted because a lot of scholarship actually pits the Chicago School and the Austrian school / market tradition against each other because there are a lot of differences between both schools of thought. But I think that in the field of antitrust, both have very similar ideas of competition. And even though the Chicago School doesn't always use terminology like the Austrians do, there's a lot of overlap. And I find that the New Brandeisians, in their theory, fail to grasp this process of competition. They state that competition takes place across multiple margins or that firms act competitively in different ways, whether through price or innovation, but their actual theories don't allow firms to act in different ways. If you change your price at all, if you alter your price for marginal cost, you're instantly considered an anti-competitive threat, and that doesn't allow firms to compete. And their theory obviously looks at firms at singular moments in time and claims to know whether they're anti-competitive or not, so they don't know the full story. So wrapping up, I argue that the New Brandeisian attack on the Chicago School falls flat. I think the Chicago School has a rich conception of consumer welfare and of competition and is not bound by these neoclassical models. They clearly see the marketplace for what it is, a realistic, thriving, ever-changing environment, rather than a static blackboard model. And I argue that the New Brandeisians actually commit the same sins that they accuse the Chicago School of committing. And again, I want to stress that I think the Chicago School has closer ties to the market process tradition than is often acknowledged. But in conclusion, has the Chicago School failed? Should we throw it out? Should we overhaul antitrust theory in favor of the New Brandeisian movement? I argue no. And that isn't to say that everything that the Chicago School has ever written will answer all of our questions about big tech. I think there's a need for new scholarship to arise using Chicago techniques, perhaps updating some of the Chicago techniques and investigating these big tech platforms and applying Chicago concepts to these platforms. And what's really surprising in economics is that no one is really doing this. My professors and my colleagues at George Mason all the time send me emails and say, can you please send me over what's going on with antitrust? Who's doing research? They know I'm all interested in this topic. And I never have anything to send them because the last thing that was published was a few years ago. And the last thing published before that was 10 years ago. So there's a need for new scholarship. We need to be addressing these questions. The Chicago School, its stronghold, which was once taken for granted over antitrust, is under threat by the New Brandeisians. They have a lot of political power right now. So if we care about these ideas, if we care about preserving the legacy of the Chicago School, we need to sort of step up, refresh the research, continue making arguments in favor. But with that, I will conclude and thank you all very much for listening. If you guys have questions about what I talked about or about grad school, particularly grad school at George Mason, feel free to shoot me an email. But thank you all.
Thank you.